Okay, good afternoon. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and delighted to welcome you here for a luncheon book talk with Philip K. Howard. I want to first begin by thanking the people that made this event possible, our friends at the Pacific Research Institute. Their president there is Sally Pipes, who's received an honorary degree from us. And so please join me in thanking Sally and the folks at Peon. We have partnered a few times on events, and so this is just the next in a series, and one that is certainly so vital here in California, a discussion of the power and influence of public sector unions. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to point out just the relevance of his important book, which we have for you here, Not Accountable. I don't know, Philip, if you saw this piece in Los Angeles Magazine. This was just about a year and a half ago, in an interview with the head of the LA Teachers Union, Cecily Maillard-Cruz. Again, it was in Los Angeles Magazine in August of 2021. To frame that for you, this was also at the time of the recall election for governor here in the state. And in a rather revealing interview titled Cecily Maillard-Cruz's Hostile Takeover of LA's Public Schools, Cecily talks about the many things that have been overblown as it related to COVID response, namely, as she points out, that there is no such thing as learning loss, which, as we all know today, has been proven to be a very serious issue as we come out of this COVID era. But there was one particular quote here that I wanted to draw our attention to that reminded me of the importance of this conversation. At a certain point in the interview, Cecily is being asked, really by what appears to be a bewildered reporter, why the union is being so strong in maintaining these lockdown policies, and whether she was concerned, as you were beginning to see parents responding in a way as activists to try to find a way to open the schools, whether she was concerned about her own position as head of the teachers union. And also understanding that the shutdowns in many ways were some of the energy and impetus for the broader gubernatorial recall that was going on. And so at one point in this article, she says this, and this is a direct quote. "But here's the trouble. You can recall the governor, you can recall the school board, but how are you going to recall me?" Now, this, it appears, is at the foundation, the issue that we're going to be talking about today. In a democratic republic framed by our Constitution, how is it that we have policy influencing, policy making institutions and organizations that are not really accountable to the broader public? Again, to use Cecily's words, how are you going to recall me? Again, to really state out directly that I am not really accountable to voters or even parents. I am accountable to my union members, which in many ways should be expected. Certainly in the private sector world, we understand that unions are to be accountable to their members. That's who they're intended to represent. But when those unions move into the private sector and get involved in setting policy, who are they really accountable to? So again, I am delighted to welcome the speaker here today, Philip K. Howard, a leading speaker and writer on legal policy reform on the issues of bureaucracy. He is the author of several best-selling books, including The Death of Common Sense, which I'll tell you, Philip, and let you know, that was a book that I read in the late 90s, which really made me think about going back to policy school. If you have not read that, or some of his other books, The Collapse of the Common Good, or a rather wistfully titled, and certainly a condition that I wonder myself, a book titled Life Without Lawyers. In 2002, he formed the nonpartisan nonprofit Common Good, which is committed to reducing red tape and bureaucracy, and is here to discuss his latest book, Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. The format for this discussion today is that Philip will set the table, going back over the themes of his book, and then we will open it up to questions for our last half hour together. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Philip K.
Yeah, so it's all my fault that Pete's here. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pete, for those generous words. People think about public policy as big decisions of climate change or immigration or such. My concern in most of my writings is not so much with big policy, but just how things get done day to day. I mean, how do you run a good school? What's it take to be a good teacher? What's the right way to give permits for infrastructure? How do you do things? And so I really I was trained as a microeconomist before I decided I had to support my family and went to law school. But people ask me why I went to law school, so I couldn't think of anything else to do. But so my focus on policy is really how things work and why things work, because I think that's what most people want, and I argue is the source of much of the alienation and frustration in American society today, is a sense that nothing works the way it should, and people's own views don't make a difference. People don't have a sense of ownership of their own lives and their own communities. So I've written this new book, which tells a story. It's quite a recent story. So 50 years ago, without anyone really noticing, and for no good reason, the public employee associations, which existed, got political leaders to grant them the powers of collective bargaining. And their argument was we should be treated just like industrial unions, the auto workers and such, so why can't we have collective bargaining powers? And so California, 38 other states, in just a very few years, granted public employees collective bargaining powers on the basis that it was just a matter of, quote, elementary fairness to treat them the same as industrial workers. What's happened in those 50 years is that the legal obligation of government to make a deal on behalf of all workers for the union, and so that's what collective bargaining is. An official has a legal obligation to make a contract that applies to all the workers in the bargaining room. That's been used by the unions to basically seize control of the operating machinery of government. And that's not an exaggeration. So, for example, in the United States today, at all levels of government, there's near zero accountability. You cannot get rid of a public employee. There's an 18-year study in Illinois which found that an average of 2 teachers out of 95,000 were dismissed each year for poor performance. That's actually twice the rate as in California. 99% of all federal employees get a fully successful rating. In the 10 years before the George Floyd killing by this police officer in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Police Department had received 2,600 complaints for abusive or behavior or undue force by police officers. Those 2,600 complaints resulted in 12 examples of discipline, of which the most severe was a 40-hour suspension. So, across all levels of government, it's basically impossible to get rid of somebody because of their performance. The harm of zero accountability is not just that you have bad employees, but that's bad enough. And there was a Stanford professor, Eric Hanishek, who said that if you got rid of the worst 5% of the teachers in this country, you would improve overall academic achievement by something like 50%. I mean, it was just incredible. So having bad public employees is bad enough, and you need to get rid of them. But the far more important effect of no accountability is that it corrodes the culture of the organization, because there's no mutual trust that everybody else is trying hard. So what happens is sort of organizational psychology 101. People go to the office or go into their department or go into the school. They know that their performance doesn't matter, so why go the extra mile? Why stay late to help this child when you know that nobody else is, or the other people might not be? The psychologist did a study, and one of them said, well, one bad apple spoils the barrel. And it doesn't mean that every school is bad, because there are many good schools, many good public departments for that matter. So culture can trump, a good culture can trump no accountability, but it takes extraordinary leadership or extraordinary history to do that. So in general, the effect of no accountability is to make it so that government, on average, government departments are places you would never want to work. Because who wants to work in an organization where there's no water? And the third point of the third problem of no accountability is that democracy is nothing but a process of accountability. You elect somebody, thank you very much. You elect somebody, they do a lousy job. You elect someone else or a new party to do a good job. We have all these politicians who run for office promising change we can believe in, or drain the swamp, or whatever, and then nothing ever happens. Well, it doesn't happen because they actually don't have the tools of management. Madison at one point talked about democracy, and he said, the president is elected, and he has executive power, and everyone within the executive branch, from the lowest level to the middle level to the highest grade, is accountable to the president. Well, in America today, nobody is accountable to anyone. And so you have a system where the most important tool of democracy, which is accountability, are you doing a good job or not? Are you trying hard or not? Do you have good judgment? Do you cooperate with others? All the things needed to make something work, none of those judgments are available. Second problem with the public union contracts is that they're hundreds of pages long, and they detail exactly how public agencies should be run. I go through lots of examples, but basically they're so rigid that you can't, anything out of the ordinary has to be negotiated. You move offices, who sits in what desk has to be negotiated with the union rep. There's a new version of Word that goes onto the computer in the federal government. You have to have a negotiation with the union rep about how that's used. There's a pandemic. There's nothing in the contract about teaching in a pandemic, so we don't have an obligation to teach in the pandemic. Distance learning, there's nothing in the contract about doing distance learning, so that's separately negotiated, and it turns out that the teachers in Broward County, I know one fact, negotiated they only had to teach 3 hours a day. And as Pete was suggesting, the effects, the learning loss, have been really transformed. I mean, it's horrible, especially for inner city kids who've lost something like behind their peers from 2 years before. I think it was 17% less knowledge as a result of what's happened during the pandemic, and the experts don't think it can ever be recovered. So you've, in various ways, actually ruined kids' lives by these contracts that basically said the teacher didn't have to teach. Nurses went to work, grocery workers and delivery people went to work, but not the teachers. The contracts, you know, it sounds like it's all about good and safe work conditions. You read the contracts, the provisions are actually designed for inefficiency. You would be hard-pressed to read a union contract and see anything in the contract that might be in the public interest. So there are studies that's showing that trash collection in big cities, unionized trash, costs twice what private carters charge in the same cities. The MTA, during the pandemic, thought it needed to sanitize all the subways in New York City, so they didn't have the workers to do that, so they hired private contractors to do it. Turned out that the private contractors did 3 times as much work as the transit workers because they weren't subject to the same work rules. So we're talking about a beta, a change, a difference in cost of 2x, 3x, something like that. And the unions have also made government largely unaffordable. They've negotiated for health care and pension benefits that are gold-plated, that bear no resemblance to reasonable practice, commercial practice in business. The Los Angeles teachers are on strike today for 3 days in sympathy for the service workers who have gone on strike. And the service workers, like all people doing these jobs in this economy, it's a serious problem in our country, really can't make enough to support a family. You know, the jobs that you have at McDonald's or whatever, you make $25,000 a year or something, you can't support a family on that. And there are many policy issues about how we deal with people with low-paying jobs, which have been kept low-paying because of the pressures of globalization and such. The teachers went out on strike in sympathy for them. So 400,000 kids have no learning again. Welcome to Los Angeles. So no learning again for 3 days. What's ironic about this, of course, is why doesn't the Los Angeles Unified School District have the money to give a raise, wouldn't cost that much, 1% of the budget, to these service workers? Because of the teachers' union contracts. Any other business could, with a budget of $20 billion, looking to find 1%, could figure out ways to do this more efficiently. One person did a calculation that said if retired teachers simply took advantage of already available public health plans like Medicare, that it would save enough money to give a $7,000 a year raise to each of the 7 workers. Just that one change. But the teachers' union contract, completely gold-plated, that bloats up the budget of the city of Los Angeles, so they have no money for anything else, and the service workers get the leftovers. So what we're seeing is hypocrisy in action. Teachers using up the budget, often for no reason, and inefficient work rules, with the result there's no money left for anyone else. So this is terrible, again, at all levels of government, for the delivery of services. So the bottom line here is that because of these union controls, voters elect mayors and governors and a president who in significant ways are only figureheads. They're elected to run the operating machinery of government, but they actually don't have the authority to do it. And they can't do anything about it because the collective bargaining agreements are not coterminous with electoral terms. So they get elected, they're bound by these contracts. And then when the contracts come up for negotiation, in most states, if there's a disagreement over the terms of the new contract, the dispute goes to an arbitrator who decides it. Well, and the arbitrator is approved by the unions. So who elected them? So the voters have been completely cut out of the loop. You elect someone with no authority, they're bound by a contract, you want to change the contract, you can't do that either. So people have complained about public unions for a long time, and I've been writing books about bureaucratic structures and such. And I think most people basically assumed that there's nothing you could do about it. Everybody else said unions, what do you do? In fact, I was telling the group yesterday, my book came out end of January, and I submitted an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal. I thought this would be red meat for the Wall Street Journal, and they turned it down. And nobody, I didn't get reviews or anything for a couple of weeks. And I was thinking, gosh, what's wrong here? And I realized that people thought it was too good to be true. that the arguments that I was making, I was about to make, really weren't true. And then I started getting some reviews by some thoughtful lawyers saying, hey, wait a minute, this is serious. Because what I did in the book, or do in the book, is I look at it, I look at the union problem not as a matter of just of inefficiency or what power, which all of which are in the book, but through the lens of constitutional governance. So how can democracy work when the people we elect don't have the authority to do their jobs? So it turns out that there's this basic first principle of constitutional governance called the non-delegation clause. It comes out of John Locke's second treatise. The non-delegation clause says that if you're elected in a democracy as an official, you can't delegate your governing authority to any private group. Or you can't sell it, but people could sell it, or give it away, because you've been given a sacred trust by the voters to govern, and you have to keep that trust and make decisions, for better or for worse, and be subject to their vote in the next election cycle. The non-delegation doctrine is embodied in several places in the United States Constitution. One of them is called the Guarantee Clause in Article 4. And the Guarantee Clause provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state a republican form of government. That's all it says. And what that means is, remember from school that a republic, the whole idea of a republic is that voters elect somebody for a fixed term of years, and then they act on their best judgment to run the government, to make choices for the government. They can't be, except under limited circumstances, recalled because the voters don't like them anymore. They have a fixed term of years in which to exercise their best judgment, not to be subject to the whims of the mob and all of that. So that was the whole idea. So what was meant by the Guarantee Clause, and Madison talks about it in the constitutional debates, is that whatever form of government a state adopts, whatever form of democratic government, the person who is elected can't give their power to some private group. So they can't give it. They were worried about giving over powers to aristocrats or nobles, who would be sort of permanent government, or to, quote, any favored class. So the idea of this is just, if you're given the power, you've got to keep it. You can't give it away. Well, what's happened here is the legislatures, in passing laws that require collective bargaining and lots of other controls that I go through in the book, have given away the executive power to a private group, the unions, who can veto decisions, who can refuse to come to the classroom, who can do all sorts of things unilaterally, because how are you going to recall, what's her name? How are you going to recall Cecily? So it seemed to me that this was a clear violation, giving the unions these powers, a clear violation of the Guarantee Clause. Now, when I talk about this, the problem, the challenge with this argument is that the Supreme Court has never actually decided the case on the Guarantee Clause. There have been 4 cases that came before it. Each one involved a political question, and the first one involved which of 2 competing constitutions in Rhode Island was more Republican than the other, and the Supreme Court held wisely that's a political question to be decided by the legislature or by the voters, not by a court. And so in the cases that have come up, the Supreme Court has held that the Guarantee Clause is, quote, non-justiciable, which means it ought to be decided by the political. But the issue raised by giving powers to the public unions is not a political question. It's not a political question whether the person elected to run the school system should have authority to run the school system. That's just a basic constitutional structure for it. It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat or any other party. It's a question of who's supposed to have the authority to run the government. And if you give it away, that's not a partisan issue, it's a violation of it. So I feel pretty comfortable that taking this up to the Supreme Court, we would have a serious chance of winning, and we're in the process of trying to organize these lawsuits. I make a couple of other arguments. FDR, who was a big proponent of private trade unions, was a huge opponent of public sector collective bargaining. He said the process of collective bargaining cannot be transplanted into the public sector. And one of the reasons is because public employees owe a fiduciary duty of loyalty to the public. And the whole idea of banding together to organize against the public interest is just a direct conflict of interest. An early labor law leader, Samuel Gompers, refused to let police join the CIO because he said it was a conflict of interest. You can't. You're there to protect the public. You can't negotiate against the public. And that was the standard wisdom until the 1960s. And so one of the points I argue is that the whole idea of public employees organizing millions, there's 7 million public employees, they collect $5 billion a year in dues, organizing the huge mass of modern government to be an interest group against the reform of modern government is an inherent conflict of interest and should be unconstitutional. There's no constitutional theory that currently, and I talk about this in the book, of loyalty, but there should be. And it's very limited. It's just, you can have any political view you want, but you can't organize millions of people against the public interest. And so I think there are significant legal, principled, constitutional reasons why what's happened should be unconstitutional. If we rewind the clock, you say, well, what went wrong here? Well, it turned out that the premise of giving public employees collective bargaining rights, the matter of elementary fairness, whatever, was always misguided. The difference between trade unions and public employee unions is not a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. If a trade union were to argue for inefficient work rules, they would soon find they had no job because the company would move out of town or go out of business. If the amount of bargaining by a trade union is just over dividing the pie of profit, basically. You know, how much goes to capital and how much goes to labor. That's, in the old days, it was safety, regulation was preempted and all that. Government makes no profit. So the negotiations are whatever we can force the taxpayers to pay. There's no limit. The only limit is sort of a political limit or a public relation limit. But the biggest difference is that in the private sector, if management colluded with some complicit workers to do some sort of sweetheart deal, that would be unlawful. In the public sector, collusion is the way the game is played. These unions amass, as I said, billions of dollars. They, in a recent New Jersey gubernatorial race, they gave tens of millions of dollars to the candidate they wanted. Union employees were the senior staff for the governor's campaign office. Busloads of union members manned the phone banks. More busloads went door-to-door canvassing. They get the governor elected, and then the collective bargaining agreement comes out. They don't sit on the other side of the table. They sit on the same side of the table. It's not a negotiation, it's a payoff. So this whole idea, we're going to be treated the same, was basically corrupt from the beginning. Because people didn't fully understand. They didn't think through the heyday of the rights revolution. Let's just give everybody more rights and think it was going to be fair. They didn't understand that they created something that would be terrible for society. And so what did they create? They created a new spoils system. 150 years ago, spoils system, everybody hated the spoils system because people, in exchange for government, for contributions and campaign work and such, people who were incompetent got jobs. So here we are, 150 years later, we thought we'd created a civil service system and a merit system. Instead, we have an anti-merit system, and people who have enormous political clout and help with campaigns get to keep their jobs no matter how badly they do. So democracy can't work on these terms. It just can't deliver. We're probably spending twice as much as we should for new services. There are lots of things that need to happen in this society where we don't have the resources to do it. And we can't get anywhere, just like we can't pay service workers in Los Angeles because of the way the teachers union is negotiating this contract. So that's the reason I think these should be unconstitutional. And more broadly, the public ought to come to look at this problem as a scandal, not as just a force of nature and the status quo, because it's completely unacceptable in any terms. Thank you.
All right, we'll open it up for questions, and I will take the dean's prerogative and ask you first. Philip, you're, as you are in all of your work, very bipartisan in the discussions around public policy issues and reform. In this particular book, you look at issues that impinge upon supporters generally of Republican candidates like the police unions, and also looking at teachers unions who generally support candidates on the left. I wonder to what degree you've seen the events just of these last few years. I mentioned the Meyer Cruz, that I think in many ways COVID and the lockdown of schools really made it evident to many Californians in this case. It was really the energy that drove the recall of a very popular governor, at least by election results. But at the same time, with the murder of George Floyd, you saw an examination of what was happening within police departments that was allowing for so-called bad apples to continue on in their service. To what degree have the events of these last couple of years made this set of issues particularly?
Yeah, much more salient. I mean, the teachers not going back to work, the continued examples of which I think are isolated of police misconduct. And the worst thing to me about police misconduct is not that there will be occasional policemen who misbehave, but that's true in all organizations. But being a policeman, being a teacher, all these jobs are hard jobs. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be a separate discussion, which we're going to try to start, of what should the deal be for teachers? What should the deal be for police? But the worst thing to me about what's happened in many of the recent police incidents is that other policemen stood by and watched. And so in any healthy organization, people need to feel empowered to step in and do what they think is right. It's kind of a Hannah Arendt kind of thing. You've got to have your own compass of right and wrong and stand for it.
But then being a culture that
but you have a culture in which there's no accountability, and in the police, you never call anybody out, the blue wall of silence, all that kind of stuff. That's the wrong culture. But it is hard being a policeman, and frankly, there are a lot of reforms on the left that have really made it hard to be a good cop. You got to prove probable cause when you can't prove an instinct, but you know that the person's up to no good, that kind of thing. So they clearly need a new deal, and I'm starting to talk to some friends of mine who know something about this. I've never written about policing, about what that might look like. In the case of teachers, also, they've been crushed by bureaucracy. You know, they've lost their power to maintain discipline in the classroom because of bureaucratic left-wing ideas of due process, stuff like that. So teachers have also had things done to them that were unfair, but the unions are not the solution. The unions are part of the problem. You know, again, you don't have the culture. So if you're a teacher, we have a daughter who's a teacher, you know, you want, it's an incredibly important job, and their ability to emote and to adapt to the needs of the students in front of them, all that's just incredibly important. So the last couple of years have been really important because it's making people kind of stand up and say, wait a minute, this system is not working as it should.
Questions?
I guess my main question is, how would we even start with solving an issue like this when it's so deeply ingrained into?
Again, I'm sorry, I'm deaf. So.
How would we even start with like fixing this issue to begin with when it's so deeply ingrained into the makeup?
You know, people undervalue the role of authority. I mean, if you can lose your job because you cancel a speaker or you kick out of school, or if you misbehave, then guess what? People are less prone to do that. So we're looking for, and already have some things in action, to bring lawsuits that will go to the courts, and some will win, some will lose, and ultimately, hopefully, get to the Supreme Court to raise this issue. And if these controls, in whole or part, are held to be unconstitutional, then the question becomes one of institutional design. What should replace them? And so that's important. But having the fight is itself important, because judges don't make decisions in a vacuum. So if people running for president in 2024, or some governor running for office in California, start raising this issue as an issue of outrage, that outrageous that a lousy teacher can sleep through class, or the teachers don't go back to school, or that they're using up all the resources so there's none left for either the service workers or the arts program or the whatever. I mean, I'll tell you, a friend of mine runs a very successful charter school network in New York City, where her class size, smaller budget than the New York City schools, her class size is deliberately large so that she has resources left over for art and music. The children, because she thinks it's important, children in elementary school and on up, to have exposure to culture, because life shouldn't just be reading and writing, it's other things too. And just give one factoid from her school system. Many of her schools share the same building with a public school. And all of the students in her schools are picked by lottery. So they're in the same cohort of students as the students in the public school. In one of the schools in 2019, her school, the elementary school, was ranked 37th out of 2,400 schools in New York State for academic achievement. 37th. Of the same cohort of students. The school the public school which shared the same building was ranked 1,694. So that's the difference in the scale of quality if you can actually manage something without all these rigid rules. You can have bigger class sizes, but have more, it's just, you make it so you have a longer days, longer school year, all sorts of things that were recommended in that report in 1983, A Nation at Risk, that never happened because of why? The unions.
Gary.
You drew some parallels between the public and private sectors. In private business, you have to operate efficiently or eventually you go broke. If you're heavily capitalized, you can extend that for a long while. But as we learned with General Motors years ago, even the largest can fail. You're subject to either collapse or hostile takeover. Now, as a nation,
That's why God invented leveraged buyout funds.
so as a nation, now to go back to the public sector, we're competitive on the world stage, at least we need to be. Now we're competing against China, who would like to run a hostile takeover on us, and other nations that are not doing these things. So have you gained any traction with our Congress, our leaders, about the dangers we're running, not just as terms of inefficiencies and accountability, but the dangers we run of eventually running ourselves into the ground to where the hostile takeover takes place?
You know, I think the metaphor is more like lemmings, but so I think we're also rushing toward the cliff. No, there's no traction in Washington. No leadership will come out of Washington. Washington is an engine of the status quo. All those 10,000 interest groups. It's amazing what $20,000 can buy you in Congress, can buy you a veto. You're not going to get change out of Washington. Everybody there is making a perfectly good living, you know, running the little thing in the gerbil cage, right? So, no, the change will come from the outside. And so, is it taking over a party? I think the Republican Party should be taken over. I think the Democratic Party is kind of not ripe for that yet, for a variety of reasons. One of the advantages of this argument I'm making is it allows Republicans to do something they've never thought about doing for a long time, which is to actually be the party of good government. Because the Democrats can't be the party of good government because they're on the take. I mean, Pete said that the police unions do support Republicans, but aside from the problem we talked about, the kind of culture problem, they don't have the inefficiency problem to nearly the degree all the other unions. They're on the line, on the beat, you know, protecting people. They're not, you know, by and large, costing twice as much as they should. They need a cultural reform, but they're not the main problem. By the way, they're not the biggest either. Teacher unions, 4.5 million workers, all the police unions combined, maybe 400,000, 500,000 workers. It's much, you know, much smaller. So it's the bureaucratic unions, the office workers and such, and the teachers unions that are the real problem. But the change is not going to come from Washington. It needs leadership. It needs people running on these issues. But the power is going to come from public outrage. It's not going to come from the people in office.
Yes.
So I want to talk about Janice B. AFSCME.
Sure.
A lot of groups thought that Janice B. AFSCME would solve the union issue. I actually worked on Janice B. AFSCME in the context of I would go to government buildings and let public employees know that they could leave their unions. I got surrounded by 20 Teamsters, followed home, personally harassed, because I was trying to educate workers that they could leave their unions. And so I would like you to speak to the constitutionality of intimidation tactics,
Right.
and from within the context of freedom of speech. I think that this
Right.
is-
So there was a decision in 2018 by the Supreme Court that held that unions, that a state government could not force non-union members to pay agency fees to the unions because those agency fees were being used for political speech, and it was forced speech. It was a violation of the First Amendment, and it was called the Janus decision. And so the question is, so then Janus comes down, and then the unions then start engaging in intimidation tactics to prevent people from leaving the union or from no longer paying their fees and such. So in New Jersey, they actually passed a law that said that if anyone in any supervisor in government tried to encourage or even told a worker that they didn't have to belong to the union that the government would be liable in damages to the union for the dues, simply informing people of their First Amendment rights. And as you just said, they've engaged in incredible intimidation tactics to prevent people from knowing their real rights. And if you try to actually do what you do, then they harass you. The political tactics of the unions are brutal. They are thugs. These are not people who stand for what's right. They are people who will intimidate you. The legislators, if you cross them a little bit, they will bring in money from out of state unions to get you out of office. And so I go through these stories in the book. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And yes, there should be some legal recourse on that. I haven't thought about, what it should be, but they're denying you your First Amendment rights, by basically acting like thugs when you're trying to tell other people. Yeah, it's another reason why this evil empire has to be, it's time to sort of slay the dragon.
Yes. No.
Okay. So you said there has to be kind of a popular support for this going forward. We've got over 20 million people in this country that work in some type of union situation.
Well, they work in government. 7 million are union members.
Okay, all right. So I'm just wondering how you would get union members. What would you propose to replace this? I've worked I was a teacher with LAUSD for a while. I was also a reporter for Channel 9 News. Both had unions. One was public sector, one was private sector. I never joined the union when I was a teacher, but I had to pay into it. This was in the 80s, the early 80s. And I found it very onerous, both public and private sector unions. I couldn't edit my stories at Channel 9 because I couldn't touch the joystick on the tape,
It's truly the union rules. I had a friend who was deputy mayor under Bloomberg who came in, he'd been mayor of Indianapolis. He came in to help out the Bloomberg make government work better. And he wanted to go around some departments and just ask the public employees if they had any ideas about how things could work better. He was told that would be unlawful because that would be direct, quote, direct dealing. You can only discuss how to run a department with the union rep. See, literally you're muzzled. You can't be your manager. You can't talk to your own employees about how to manage it better. I mean, it's just incredible. I mean, the concept of overreach is just not one that the unions are familiar with. I mean, they are. It's a kind of tyranny.
Yeah, that article I quoted before, which I think everybody, certainly every Angelino should read. There were many people quoted who would not give their names just out of fear.
Right. Will you send me the article?
Yeah.
I'll pay you $5.
You take it out of the auto. Yes, John.
Thank you so much for sharing. I have a couple of questions. Given the fact that I don't think anyone realistically assumes that Congress will do anything, given the fact that what you're describing is nothing new, that's the way it's been for hundreds of years, it's not going to change. We can't count on it. Thugs are thugs, right? Couple of questions then. If we actually want to affect change, shouldn't we be focusing more not on the crowd, but innovation? Large language model AI replacing the DMV in friendly red jurisdictions so that there are no employees. Number one. Number two, there are non-delegation clauses in state constitutions. So again, wouldn't it be easier to fight that fight and establish a precedent first in a Texas or a Florida and address the union issue at the state level first, and then let the finances work? Singapore has no minimum wage. This whole service issue, it's a fiction. It's based on a bankrupt foundation in America. Okay, it has nothing to do with minimum wage laws or living. That's all a lie. So wouldn't it be better to start at a local level, or in the case of like a receivership, let's say Puerto Rico or some Jackson, Mississippi goes broke, right? And there's just no money and everything has to be fixed. right? Wouldn't that be an easier vector?
Well, first of all, anything that works would be good, so I'm not against doing things at a local level. But most of the states where you might have a chance in the courts are states that don't have the problem. So,
But there are pensions in Florida, for example.
okay,
Right,
now, well,
public use.
Florida has something of a problem, I agree with that. But in most states, again, the Supreme Court gets appointed or elected in part with the support of the union. So one of the reasons why, in general, state-based reform efforts don't work is because there's the whole body of law rejecting the kind of arguments that I made in California and Illinois. So the state courts have generally been hopeless. That's number one. Number two is I don't get the kind of attention for this argument if I make an argument based on some state. I get it based on the fact that it's a national problem. So you want to get sort of the narrative going, the political narrative going, and the policy narrative going, you really have to make it on a national level. That isn't to say you can't have solutions on the
The
state.
point is you nationalize it, picking the right plaintiff, picking the right court, the right jurisdiction, the right case, right?
Yeah, so we're gonna bring separate cases in Illinois. We'd like to bring separate cases in California. We're talking about bringing separate cases in New York. So we're gonna have separate cases in different places. But if you want to have a national discussion about what this has happened,
But you're picking those states to lose and then appeal to the Supreme Court, right?
not necessarily, because I'm going to federal court. I'm not going to state courts. I'm going to the federal court. Federal court is different than the state court. So but if you or anybody you know has an idea about how to bring a case in Florida, and a plaintiff who would bring it, and that I do think that state courts are not a welcome home for this, probably anywhere, but maybe there's some places there are. But anyway, but I think it's important to have a national discussion to set the stage, even for a local effort.
Couple more questions. I just want to make sure we got some students here.
So should public sector unions meet their fateful end one day, do you see problems that policy is going to have to address or kind of downstream effects of just kind of abolishing these unions, or?
Yeah, I think we need a new deal. We can't just abolish them. We need a new deal. So we're talking to some people at the University of Chicago about doing a forum on, what should the deal for teachers be, for example. I think it's really important. I think there are many public employees, particularly higher level policy public employees, who ought to get paid more. But the one thing you can't tolerate is deliberate, designed inefficiency and waste. I mean, and you can't tolerate no accountability, and you can't actually accept a system in which judgment is unlawful. Everything good in life happens because some people exercise their judgment about what to do. Trial and error. Who's working hard, who's not. Who's a good writer, who's not. Who's good at dealing with who cooperates, who's not. These things are completely not susceptible to legal processes. You can have checks and balances on them, but you have to be able to make judgments about people. So yes, there needs to be a new deal. There need to be checks and balances to make sure that people aren't treated unfairly or for the wrong reasons and stuff. But those are judgment-based. They're not, legal procedure.
Gordon, did you have?
Okay. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. There's so much sort of paralysis that I think the regular person can recognize, but they don't really understand the structure behind it. And I do like your idea of the legal recourse, but given that our media seems to be very captured, and I've been noticing for years how important issues, for instance, teachers who don't want to be a part of a union, you never hear about them. Everything's sort of just a big, bubble of teachers versus students. So we really don't have the type of newsworthy news that used to exist. How do you mobilize public outrage? How do you get the momentum to carry forward people understanding what citizenship means, what the founding documents are supposed to protect us from?
Right. I was hoping you could help with that. Yesterday, a person who I've done a little work with in the past, who used to be a writer for The Daily Show, when Jon Stewart was running it, came to talk in Orange County. And so he and I are talking about doing some cartoon videos on, this is one little thing, on the difference between public and private unions. Because people assume they're the same, and in fact, one's corrupt and one's not. So, but the answer is, generally, I don't know. Someone asked me the other day, well, if you had $10 million, how would you spend it? I said, I have no idea. So, because I'm a guy, I'm trained as an economist, right? I write the books and I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a political leader, so I'm talking to political leaders. I'm talking to Nikki Haley's staff, I'm talking to staff of some other people. And I don't care if they win or not. I just want them to talk about the issue, because I think it's potentially attractive. So the only way I know how to do this is to get people who are in the news to talk about it. And that could be, it doesn't have to be a political leader, it could be a movie star, If you know Kim Kardashian, great. But it's, so there's an alchemy involved in doing this. Being here is important, but how, the butterfly its wings, how do you know what's going to happen when? I mean, the book seems to have struck a nerve, getting a lot of attention. It just got off a podcast with a bunch of liberals who are basically saying, well, we don't know if your constitutional argument is good, but boy, this is a serious problem for democracy. So that's great. We got them thinking about it. So.
I'm sorry, I just want to throw in one thing. The school boards, the parents that are getting involved on the local level are really a good source of spreading information.
Well, I don't know how to get to them, but that's your job. So you can, no, seriously. So the teachers' unions have now taken over many school boards. They have a deliberate union strategy of running teachers to school boards and funding it. And the school board elections have between 6 and 8 people voting. So if you get 4 people voting for that person, they're running the schools. So we need to. So that's you're absolutely right. So getting parents, mobilizing parents actually is a great idea.
Yeah.
I don't know how to mobilize parents, but mobilizing them is a brilliant idea. And if you have any ideas on how to do, everybody else here has to do that, that would be a great project. And we would raise money to fund outreach campaigns that probably be best run by young people who know how to do social media stuff, not by old people like me. And that would be a great, we could create a summer job program where grad students at college, have a mobilized parents, to fight this. But great idea. Let's do it. We can make it for that.
We have time for one more question. Chloe.
Okay, first of all, thank you for speaking with us today. This is fascinating and quite honestly outraging when you really talk about it. But I currently work with the Liberty Justice Center, which is the
Sure.
They represented the Clinton and Janice.
Yeah, I'm working with them too.
Great. So we're on the same
There you
page.
are. I'm going to tell them you know me.
Yeah, that'll look good for
No, I'm going to tell them I know you.
Well, part of what I do is a Janice client searches where we're literally just sending out. It sometimes feels like we're just like throwing darts and seeing what hits. And so I was just curious if you had any strategy on. Is it like finding the right? Because a lot of times you're just hoping that someone who's brave enough is like, wait, I was never told that.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to do, especially when you're talking about California. We're not even reaching out to people in California at this point because it's like, who's going to step forward in California?
Right.
It ruins your entire career, everything. So I'm just curious, like, what is the strategy when you're looking for an individual to represent?
Okay, so the kind of cases you're looking for are looking for individuals who have been, kind of are not able to exercise their rights. The kinds of cases that I'm looking for, by and large, are by elected mayors or governors or a school board, that itself, votes that we want to challenge the union contract or whatever. Any group with executive authority is the group I need to bring a lawsuit. And so it's not a citizen, it's a person who is unable to exercise their constitutional responsibility because of these contracts. And I think you should start secretly looking for us.
I didn't know this was going to turn into a career
Connections
development. All right, well, Philip has been gracious enough to sign some books. I want to just leave some time for that. He is going to be here for a little bit of time. I want to thank again my friends at PRI and Sally for helping me. And please join me again in thanking Philip Howell.
But let me just put a plug for PRI too. PRI is exactly the kind of group that smaller groups like mine need to work with. So the people who have the intelligence, the relationships, the values of making things work again. And so we need PRI to, or in the East Coast, we're working with the Manhattan Institute, groups like that, to actually make this happen. And so we're not a solo actor. It's a group endeavor. Thank you again.
Coalition of the Willing.